When Francis Collins picks up the phone at his hotel in Newark, the voice on the other line makes him shiver.
Hello?
Francis, I think you need to know something we're about to announce. We have to meet with you right away. Who's we? I can't tell you that. I don't mean to sound coy. I'm just not authorized to talk about it yet. No doubt Collins wants to slam the phone down. It's May 1998, and the man on the phone is Craig Venter, Collins' arch nemesis. You see, Francis Collins manages the federal government's Human Genome Project, a massive effort to sequence and read all human DNA. Venter has been a thorn in his side for years, constantly attacking the project and claiming that he can do things better. People on Collins' team mostly roll their eyes at Venter. He's a loudmouth. But something about Venter's tone makes Collins think twice that day. He has a flight from Newark to Los Angeles the next day, but he agrees to divert to Dulles Airport in Washington, D.C., and meet Venter there instead. They meet in a private room at the Red Carpet Club, a business lounge for United passengers with the swanky feel of a hotel bar. Collins has asked some of his colleagues from the Human Genome Project to join him. They arrive to the meeting place early. Venter arrives late with his own posse from the biotech company he's founded, Celera. Venter cuts right to the point. Francis, we want to give you a heads up so you don't get blindsided by the news. We don't think people want to wait around for another 7 years for you to finish the genome. Our goal is to do it ourselves, using a couple hundred new sequencing machines. We estimate we'll be done in 2001, 4 years faster than you will. Collins is shocked. If this is true, it will destroy his institute. But he's also baffled and more than a little skeptical. How does Venter's team propose to do this? Venter starts to explain his approach, the shortcuts he'll take to save time and money. Collins cuts him off. Craig, given the size and structure of the genome, it's logically impossible. We don't know if it's going to work until we try it, and neither do you. Who knows? We could fall on our ass. The two continue to argue until Venter drops a bombshell. Just because his team will finish the human genome first, he says, it doesn't mean Collins' team will be completely useless. Hey, while we do humans, you can do a mouse. Mice? Collins is appalled. The Human Genome Project, reduced to sequencing mice? Venter had thrown down a gauntlet. If Craig Venter wanted a race against Collins and his Human Genome Project, now they have it. American Innovations is pleased to have ZipRecruiter as its presenting sponsor. ZipRecruiter strives to lead the way in innovating talent recruitment for businesses of all sizes. It's the smartest way to hire. Their powerful technology sends your job post to over 100 of the web's leading job boards. And it doesn't stop there. It learns from your feedback to better understand what kind of candidate you're looking for. It's so effective that 80% of employers who post on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate through the site within the first day. Stay tuned at the end of this episode for an inside look into ZipRecruiter's culture of innovation. We talked to Dave Tuttle, the Vice President of Product Strategy, who shared more on how the team constantly works on improving its technology. And now, our listeners can try ZipRecruiter for free. That's right, free. Just go to ZipRecruiter.com/AI. That's ZipRecruiter.com/AI. One more time, that's ZipRecruiter.com/AI. ZipRecruiter, the smartest way to hire. From Wondery, this is American Innovations. I'm Stephen Johnson. A quick note that this episode contains some strong language. In our first few episodes, we heard about plenty of squabbles and competition among scientists vying to discover genes, chromosomes, and the structure of DNA. The tussles had been going on for a century. But the 1980s introduced an even bigger grudge match. Who would be the first to map the entire human genetic code? The race that came to a head in that airport lounge would get downright nasty before it was done. Along the way, a lot of good science would be done. But the science often took a backseat as politics, money, and egos all got in the way. This is episode 4 in our 6-part series on DNA, The Race for the Genome. In the decades that followed Watson and Crick's discovery of the structure of DNA, biologists had built upon their work enough to more or less understand how DNA works. They understood the process by which those 4 letters on the spine of DNA created the blueprint of life. But as big a breakthrough as this was, it only got them so far, because now that they could read the language of DNA, they actually had to sit down and do it. That is, they had to wade through the entirety of a single human being's DNA and figure out what it actually said. And that's a huge undertaking. A single person has a lot of DNA. For example, a 300-page book has around 500,000 letters. The human genome has over 3 billion letters of DNA, roughly 6,300-page books, all filled with nothing but long strings of A's, C's, G's, and T's in microscopically tiny print. To sequence all that DNA was such a huge task that it seemed almost impossible. If there's one person who pushed the race to map the entire human genome farther and faster than anyone else, it's a scientist named Craig Venter. He also pissed off the most people. Growing up, Craig Venter had not been a great student. In the 7th grade, his best grade was a B+ in science. But the rest of his report card was mostly C's and D's. He was a bit of a rebel even back then, refusing to do spelling tests because, in his words, they were stupid. He kept bucking the system. After high school, he turned down the chance to go to college on a swimming scholarship, choosing instead to take up surfing in Southern California. And then, in 1967, in the middle of the Vietnam War, he was drafted into the military. He did surprisingly well on an entry-level IQ test and opted to go into the medical corps because it knocked a year off his service time. He was soon doing liver biopsies and spinal taps, like a real doctor, and his skills earned him special privileges. He got out of daily inspections, and when he let his hair grow long, no one complained. He would later say that his experience in the Army changed his perspective. It helped him realize that knowledge is power. But it didn't change his attitude towards authority. Just before he was shipped out to Vietnam, his long hair nearly got him into serious trouble. On his final checkup, a military nurse gives him a directive. "You'll need to get your hair cut." It didn't bother anyone else. "Are you disobeying an order? Fuck off." Venter narrowly avoids a court-martial for this, and shortly afterwards, he lands in Vietnam. The war takes a heavy toll on him. He sees hundreds of men his own age die, many of them as he's trying to resuscitate them with his own hands. After a year, he makes up his mind to take his own life by swimming out into the South China Sea and not coming back. A mile out, Venter starts to get tired. He can see sea snakes in the water around him. Then, something bigger bumps him. He squints into the water. It bumps him again. And then he sees it. A shark, prodding him in a prelude to an attack. He stops swimming and treads water. Looking back, he realizes he can't see the shore. And then, as if suddenly waking from a nightmare, he thinks to himself, "What am I doing?" He wants to live more than he ever has in the previous 21 years of his life. He turns and starts thrashing for the shore, but it's tough going. Dodging the snakes and sharks, he's fighting against a fierce current. Finally, he makes it back to the beach. He's naked, exhausted, barely able to drag himself up the sand. But he does, and he just lies there, staring up at the sky in a daze, panting. In this moment, Craig Venter decides he is going to do something magnificent with his life. He doesn't know what yet, but whatever it is, it will be big, important, something people will remember him for. That brush with death forces Venter to focus on his future. His second wife would later say, "Vietnam changed him. It impressed on him the idea that time is precious, that you have to make every single minute of every single day count." Despite the horrors that he saw, the war stirred his interest in medical research. After his tour in Vietnam, he enrolled in college and earned a PhD in physiology. After working a few years as a professor in Buffalo, Venter joined the National Institutes of Health, the NIH, in 1984. It was here that Venter first started to work on the area that would make his name, DNA sequencing. Even though the science behind sequencing DNA strands had made advances, the idea that we could sequence the entire human genome had still seemed almost impossible well into the 1980s. The NIH refused to even consider a human genome project when it was first proposed. Sequence 3 billion letters of DNA and presumably 100,000 genes, all by hand? No thanks. But other government agencies are interested. The introduction of computer-based DNA sequencers in the mid-1980s made the process much, much faster. Among the first to realize this were a few biologists at the U.S. Department of Energy, studying how radioactivity damaged DNA. They realized that computer sequencing had completely changed the game. At computer speeds, 3 billion letters suddenly didn't seem so daunting. They convinced their bosses to start a 7-year, billion-dollar human genome project in 1987, using these new computer sequencers. But over at the NIH, Craig Venter's bosses are less enthusiastic. They think using computers to do the work isn't real science. They would have to be convinced. Luckily, if there was one person who could convince the NIH to do something, it's James Watson. The same James Watson whose work on the double helix had already won a Nobel Prize. And James Watson wants to sequence the human genome. It's February 1988, and in Reston, Virginia, a group of scientists have gathered to figure out what to do with $17 million the NIH has just received for genome research. For years, the scientific community has been locked in a fierce debate about the value of the Human Genome Project. This kind of project may get the politicians excited, but it's not good science. We shouldn't spend years and years copying down billions of letters. Only convicted felons should have to do the job of sequencing DNA. They could get time off for every million letters they record. The project will be too slow. If Lewis and Clark had followed a similar approach to mapping the American West, a millimeter at a time, they would still be somewhere in North Dakota. But James Watson has been working to change hearts and minds. Watson is no longer the skinny, wild-haired youth of before, but he hasn't lost any of his skill at winding people up. In particular, his wicked tongue keeps getting him into trouble. One colleague calls him the Caligula of Biology, someone who was given license to say anything that came to his mind and expect to be taken seriously. And unfortunately, he did so with a casual and brutal offhandedness. He's been traveling around the country giving stump speeches about the urgency of DNA sequencing. He reassures his fellow scientists that the work won't reduce them to scientific drones. He's also convinced Congress and the media that a human genome project would not only revolutionize biology, but it would also liberate humankind from the misery of most diseases. He even hints that hunger, poverty, and crime might end as well. Eventually, people begin to listen. After all, this is the great James Watson talking. By 1987, President Reagan approves the first allocation to the NIH for genome research. At that meeting in Virginia, Watson argues that that money should be used for an all-out effort to sequence the genome, and he makes a recommendation. And another thing, we should appoint an esteemed scientist as project director. Afterward, Watson said, "I did not realize that I could be perceived as arguing for my own subsequent appointment." But that's exactly what happens. James Watson will lead the Human Genome Project. The whole project will cost $3 billion and take 15 years. But after just 3 years, everything falls apart for Watson. The project is off the ground. Progress is slow, but things are moving forward.
Then Watson learns that an NIH neuroscientist has been using computers to massively speed up the discovery of genes. While other scientists have been working by hand to sequence the genes, this scientist has discovered 2,700 new genes. Now, everyone knows that Watson is not a huge fan of using computers and robots to conduct this research, but that's not his biggest problem. See, the scientist involved is also trying to patent the genes that he's discovered. Watson is furious, and he isn't the only one. The idea that a scientist would seek to patent genes, the code for human life, makes many scientists sick. They worry that if scientists start the race to patent certain sequences of genes, it will interfere with basic research. Guys, you probably spend a lot of mental energy thinking about eating more healthy foods and making sure to exercise. We all know we need to do that. But how much have you thought about hair loss? I know it's not the most fun topic, but did you know that 66% of men start losing their hair by the age of 35? The great news is it's easier to keep the hair you have than to replace the hair you've lost. And thanks to HIMS, that's HIMS, you can turn to science. 4hims.com is a one-stop shop for hair loss, skincare, and sexual wellness for men. They connect you with real doctors with medical-grade solutions to treat hair loss. Getting started is so easy. You just answer a few questions, a doctor reviews your profile, and products are shipped directly to your door. I got the chance to see some before and after photos of guys who've used HIMS, and the results are nothing short of staggering. Listeners of American Innovations get a trial month of HIMS for just $5 today while supplies last. Take a look at the website for full details. This is an incredible deal. It would cost hundreds if you went to your doctor or a pharmacy. So go to 4hims.com/innovations. That's FORHIMS.com/innovations. One more time, 4hims.com/innovations, and get a trial month of HIMS for just $5. It's July 1991, a hot, muggy day in Washington, D.C. There are only a few people in the drab room 366 of the Dirksen Senate office building, but things there are even warmer and tenser than they are outside. There's a Senate hearing going on, and a senator from New Mexico, Pete Domenici, calls upon James Watson to answer some questions. At this point, Watson is 63. He's spotted by age, half-bald on top, with stooped shoulders under his suit coat, but he's as feisty as ever. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Watson. What are your views on the NIH's new policy of trying to patent genes? Frankly, I think it's outrageous, Senator. Patenting them is lunacy. If these random bits of sequences can be patented, I am horrified. Thank you for your candor, as always, Doctor. And what are your thoughts about using computers to discover genes? This approach to discovering genes isn't science. Virtually any monkey could do it. The laughter in the room is tinged with embarrassment, because this isn't an innocent comment. Sitting next to Watson is the man who has pushed to use computers in gene research, the man who wanted to patent the genes he had discovered, Craig Venter. Venter is 2 decades younger than Watson, but in 1991 he's even balder, with huge round glasses. Like nearly every geneticist alive, Watson is his hero. But when Watson refers to him as a monkey, Venter pales. The hearing ends. Watson breezes out of the room. When he gets to the elevator, Watson turns to one of his colleagues and laughs off his harsh words. I was probably too hard on Craig. Watson barely gives it another thought. But Venter never forgets the sting. A technician shows up at his lab the next day in a gorilla suit, trying to make light of the situation. But Venter can't let it go. A year after that Senate hearing, James Watson resigns from the NIH project. It turns out that his boss had supported Craig Venter's efforts to patent the genes he had discovered. Never one to lay out his concerns calmly and professionally, the Caligula of Biology complained to reporters behind her back, calling gene patenting lunacy. At the same time, questions started to emerge about Watson's ownership of some biotech stocks he owned, which led to accusations of conflicts of interest. An investigation starts, and Watson feels cornered. He feels he has no choice but to resign. He tells a reporter, "I don't know how to get someone to succeed me. I don't know anyone who doesn't have stocks. And I don't know anyone who would want to live with my boss." Meanwhile, Venter has become somewhat infamous among other scientists. Venter still has the rebellious spirit of his youth and is impatient with the pace of work being done. He hated the mindless tedium of sequencing genes by hand. That was why he had pushed for using computers and robots. By automating the technique with computers and robots, he was able to cut the price for detecting a gene from $50,000 down to $20. This would become a pattern in Venter's career. He'd get itchy to do something big. Nowadays, people would say he wanted to move fast and break things. He'd then get irritated over fitful progress and find shortcuts. Other scientists would call his work sloppy or even cheating. One said it was as if Sir Edmund Hillary had decided to take a helicopter halfway up Mount Everest instead of doing the hard climb himself. But Venter doesn't care. He's focused on getting results. In 1992, frustrated by NIH bureaucracy, he quits the agency. He joins an unusual hybrid organization. It has a non-profit arm called TIGR, T-I-G-R, for the Institute for Genomic Research. TIGR, Venter claimed, was as dedicated to pure science as the NIH, but it also had a very much for-profit arm owned by a biotech company that wanted to patent genes and cash in. Venter himself gets millions of dollars in stock from TIGR's parent company, which make his claims of wanting to do pure research just a bit harder to swallow. Venter then poaches 30 staff members from his old employer and declares that TIGR would challenge the Human Genome Project for sequencing supremacy. The race is on. Even still, Genome Project scientists don't take Venter seriously as a threat at first. Their consortium is simply too big and too well-funded. Hundreds of scientists across dozens of universities, scientists in the UK and other countries, all backed by government money? Venter and his team don't stand a chance. But the government-backed project has a major flaw. All this biological firepower is following the same safe game plan. The plan is to spend the first few years mapping genes, determining the major landmarks on each chromosome. It's like if you were drawing a map of the world, sketching the outline for each continent first. And only when that's done, then they divide the chromosomes into segments and assign different segments to different teams. Only then would the full sequencing actually start. It was safe, but it was also slow. To Venter, the NIH's slowness presents an opportunity. He decides to skip that initial mapping step. In other words, instead of figuring out the shape of the map first, he'll fill in all the map details at one time, then use banks of computers to figure out how all the various pieces fit together. The NIH consortium had considered this all-at-once approach, but NIH scientists had dismissed it as slapdash. It would probably leave gaps, they said, and risked putting segments in the wrong place. As if you'd put Maine where Florida was supposed to be on a map, and Ohio on the West Coast. But Venter believes computers can overcome these challenges. This is the mid-1990s, after all, when microprocessors are getting faster. Anyway, his whole life had been based on the idea that speed should trump precision. Getting any data out there now, even preliminary data, is better than waiting 15 years for perfect data. That's what he believes. By May 1998, Venter is confident enough in his approach to make his ambitions public. His team calls in a reporter from the New York Times and gets a front-page Sunday story. In the story, Venter announces that he's founding a new company to sequence the entire genome in 3 years, 4 years before the NIH consortium is scheduled to finish. And he'll do it for 1/10 of the NIH's $3 billion budget. The Human Genome Project was a massive undertaking, perhaps the biggest government scientific project since the nuclear bomb. It's as if During the Manhattan Project, a private company had jumped in and announced plans to build its own nuclear bomb and to do it faster and cheaper. To call this audacious is a massive understatement. Venter had thrown the plans together so quickly, the new company didn't even have a name yet. It eventually becomes Celera, from the Latin word for, you guessed it, quick. To get started, the biotech company that owns Celera sells Venter's team hundreds of state-of-the-art DNA sequencers at a cost of $300,000 apiece. This bank of machines gives Venter, in one swoop, more sequencing power than the rest of the world combined. Celera also builds the world's largest non-military supercomputer to process the data. The announcement of Celera makes front-page news and rockets Craig Venter to scientific stardom. It also makes him one of the richest scientists in the world. Celera's stock price, originally $15 a share, eventually rises to $320 a share. Venter's share of that alone is suddenly worth several $100 million. Meanwhile, Venter's quick progress demoralizes the NIH consortium, which is still dragging along like the slow and steady tortoise. By 1998, the 8th year in the Human Genome Project's planned 15 years of work, the groups have collectively sequenced just 4% of human DNA. Worse, some government sequence data turns out to be contaminated with non-human DNA, an embarrassing mistake that only wastes more time. As a result, despite the consortium's head start, it seems quite possible that Venter and his supercomputer might actually catch and pass them. Or, as James Watson put it, Venter's challenge was like the Nazis invading Poland, and the NIH's project stood about as much chance as Poland had. But Venter's rival at the NIH isn't about to give up just yet. American Innovations is brought to you in part by Wix.com. You can showcase your bright ideas and innovations with Wix. They've developed artificial design intelligence that creates a stunning website for you. And now you can create your website right from your phone, which means you can open up your online store, portfolio, blog, wherever you are, even while listening to this podcast. Here's what you do. Go to Wix.com, decide what you need a website for, pick your style, add your own images, and just like that, your website is ready. Seriously, it's that easy. You'll look amazing on every device, desktop and mobile, and it takes less than 5 minutes. If only everything in life could be so simple. Great innovators can change the world, but first, the world has to know about you. So what are you waiting for? It's time to get started. Go to Wix.com, that is Wix.com, and create your very own beautiful professional website today. It's 1977. A young geneticist named Francis Collins is hiking alone in the Cascade Mountains of Washington. Born in Virginia and educated on the East Coast, he's never been west of the Mississippi before. But he's been feeling empty lately, and he needs some time to sort his life out. It's quiet in the mountains, just birds singing and his own feet crunching on the trail. He tries to enjoy the fall foliage, but his heart is just not in it. He'd been on a scientific fast track for years, earning both a PhD and a medical degree before the age of 27. But something's been missing from his life. He's been a hardcore atheist for years, convinced that science disproved God. But science alone is starting to feel empty. He's asking questions about the meaning of life, wondering if there isn't something beyond science. He's also reading C.S. Lewis and other Christian writers, and wrestling with their arguments for God. That's why he's come out here to the mountains to seek a sign. And as he rounds a bend in the trail, he gets exactly what he came for. The landscape suddenly opens up in front of him. He's confronted with a majestic view. Skies, trees, mountains. His heart lifts. And there, towering above him, is a frozen waterfall. It's 100 feet tall, a gleaming ribbon of white. It strikes him as unfathomably beautiful, undeniable evidence, he thinks, of God's hand in creation. He immediately drops to his knees and begins praying. Jesus Christ, I am opening my heart and asking you to be my personal savior. He continues to pray for some time, letting the beauty wash over him. This religious conversion would change the life of Francis Collins no less than Craig Venter's near suicide changed his. 2 decades later, this passionately religious young man would go head-to-head with Venter and become the savior of the government's Human Genome Project. When James Watson resigns from the Human Genome Project, Collins is a natural choice to take over as project head, at least scientifically. Many scientists, staunch atheists themselves, distrust the fact that he's religious. More importantly, Collins also seems to lack the dynamic personality the project needed to transform itself. In contrast to the flamboyant Venter, Collins seems dowdy. Collins, nevertheless, proves sharp. After Venter gives him the heads up about his plans to beat the NIH by sequencing the entire genome, Collins has a chance encounter on a plane that puts him back in the race.
The captain has turned on the fasten seatbelt sign. If you haven't already done so.
Soon after the meeting in the airport lounge, Collins finds himself on a flight with one of Venter's bosses from Celera's parent corporation. 30,000 feet up, Collins gets him talking about all those advanced sequencers the company has sold to Venter's team. Those are great machines. They really are. Not cheap, though. Certainly not. You know, I've been thinking, there's actually money in the NIH budget right now that we could use to buy some of those sequencers. Do you think we could buy some from you? By the time they land, Collins has sweet-talked him into supplying NIH with the same fancy sequencers that Celera is getting. Venter has just lost his big advantage. Collins' second major task is reassuring Congress, which suddenly fears it's been wasting billions of dollars backing the losing side. He announces that the consortium will reorganize and make the changes necessary to match Venter and finish a rough draft of the genome by 2001. And so the final stretch of the race begins. Celera versus NIH, Venter versus Collins. This was not your typical scientific competition. Winning was less about inspiration and elegant experiments, the usual markers of good science, and more about who had the brute computing horsepower to work faster and churn through more data. And rather than hash out conflicts in private, the two went to battle in the press. Venter trashed Collins' project in the press. Collins' project, he said, was putting good money after bad, but Collins would hit back. He called Venter's project the Cliff Notes or the Mad Magazine version. And things weren't much better within each group. Venter got into dozens of fights with his managers. Among Collins' team, the tension was showing. The German scientist at a meeting started screaming hysterically at some Japanese colleagues for making mistakes. Given all this tension, one scientist said that the human genome race had all the psychological ingredients of a war. Each team spent tens of millions of dollars in an arms race, scaling up computing power. But amid the wartime atmosphere, actual science was getting done. The pace of work was breathtaking. Celera and the NIH both quickly passed 1 billion letters sequenced, then 2 billion. But all the fighting in the world couldn't diminish one fact: that in 2 years, scientists had sequenced more DNA, vastly more, than in the previous 2 decades combined. James Watson had slammed Venter for churning out data using robots and computers, but everyone was playing Venter's game now. As if there wasn't enough competition already, some of the scientists decided it would be fun to take it up a level. It's 2000, and Francis Collins is sitting with Ewan Birney, director of the European Bioinformatics Institute. They're talking about the early results from the sequencing project, and in particular, the surprising fact that the number of genes seems to be much lower than had previously been believed. How about a little bet? A bet? Yes, a bet. Everyone puts in a few bucks, and then whoever gets closest to the total number of genes we end up finding takes home the prize. All right, that sounds fun. Francis Collins picks up a napkin and pulls out a pen. What's your starting bet? 49,551. Very specific. Collins writes it down on the napkin. Seems a little low, don't you think? In fact, Bernie's guess turned out to be too high. The estimated number of genes plummeted as the sequencing projects went on, from 100,000 or more when the project started, to 90,000, then to 70,000, then to 50,000. In the end, more than 150 scientists joined the gene sweepstakes, as the betting pool came to be known. The eventual winner was still pretty far off. Human beings only have around 20,000 genes. The prize money, meanwhile, rose to almost $1,500. If gene sweepstakes was a friendly competition among scientists, the same could not be said for the war of words between Venter and Collins. But patience for the squabble was running thin in the highest office in the land. President Bill Clinton has been keeping his eye on the Human Genome Project, and finally, in 2000, he decides to weigh in. First, he declares that the human genome belongs to all people worldwide. Next, he then calls on all scientists, including those in the private sector, to share their sequence data freely. There's even talk of eliminating all patents on genes. This has an immediate effect. Investors with money in sequencing companies like Celera head for the exits. Finally, he turns his attention to the spat between Collins and Venter. He writes a note to his top science advisor. It says simply, "Fix it. Make these guys work together." It's easier said than done. The burden for this peacemaking task falls on a biologist named Ari Petrinos. He works at the Department of Energy, which had originally started on the Human Genome Project and still has a small team contributing. Petrinos is the right person to bring the two sides together. He hates the competition between public and private groups. Venter, surprisingly, is more open to meeting than Collins, whose top aides despise Venter. But in April 2000, Petrinos gets a phone call. It's Collins.
Let's try it.
So on May 7th, over pizza and beer in Petrinos' basement, the two adversaries meet face to face. The meeting does not go well. Both Collins and Venter just don't trust each other, and there's a lot of lingering anger. Petrinos later tells a reporter, "I don't think I've ever seen them as tense as they were that day." But the two agree to give it another shot, and then another. And the more meetings they have, the more their anger thaws. With Petrinos coaxing them along, they both agree to stop taking shots at each other in public. Then, finally, there's a breakthrough. And that brings us right up to that press conference at the White House on June 26, 2000, that you heard at the start of this series.
Good morning. I want to, first of all, acknowledge Prime Minister Blair, who will join us.
Sitting behind Clinton that day are Craig Venter and Francis Collins. Collins is sitting to Clinton's left in a blue shirt and tie. Venter is on Clinton's right, clutching his speech notes. It turns out there was plenty of drama behind the scenes. In the days leading up to that announcement, Collins and Venter had gotten into an argument with Time magazine over who would appear on the cover of that week's issue. Finally, they agreed to appear together. The staging of the event needed careful managing, too.
So, Dr. Collins, please come up to the left.
Venter and Collins get equal time to speak. Neither wants to be upstaged by the other. And each one had to agree not to disparage each other's work in front of the whole world.
It is truly a humbling and profound experience to be asked to speak here this morning.
Still, despite all the drama, both Collins and Venter wear genuine smiles. And why not? Less than a century after scientists had identified the first human gene, less than 50 years after the discovery of the double helix, now, at the threshold of the millennium, we could finally read the blueprint of our human heritage for the first time. For Collins, the morning is bittersweet.
Less than 24 hours ago, I attended the funeral of my beloved sister-in-law, a wonderful marionette artist who brought magic and joy to thousands of children with her art. She died much too soon of breast cancer. The hope and promise of understanding all of the genes in the genome and applying this knowledge to the development of powerful new tools came just too late for her.
Venter, too, is in a reflective mood. He's thinking back to his military service more than 3 decades earlier.
I learned firsthand how tenuous our hold on life can be.
The first drafts of the human genome are published in early 2001, one from Celera and one from the consortium. But for anyone looking to declare one side the good guys and one side the bad guys, the papers make things complicated. Turns out they weren't entirely separate projects after all. See, throughout the project, the NIH consortium had been posting all its data online for anyone to see. And in their paper, the Celera team acknowledged that it had actually used this data to help construct its genome. Celera had built on the NIH's maps to figure out the proper order for the millions of random fragments they were finding. But in terms of the quality of the final project, most scientists who looked at both drafts side by side agreed that there was a clear winner: Celera. Some said its sequence was twice as good and less riddled with contamination. Just like he'd boasted, Venter had done things better, faster, and cheaper. Venter was right about 2 things at least. Number 1, scientists loved the early drafts of the genome, however rough. And number 2, the NIH scientists never would have pushed so hard and so fast if they hadn't been racing against Venter's team. At that press conference in 2000, with Craig Venter and Francis Collins, President Clinton also struck a note of caution. Unlocking the mystery of the human genome might also open a Pandora's box of moral issues that we need to figure out answers to. His concern was well placed. After all, the history of genetics and DNA has another, more dangerous side. That's in our next episode. Science can often seem like a collection of cold, hard facts removed from the emotional humanity of our lives. But as we saw in this episode, when politics, money, and egos get in the way, it reveals that science is just as human as anything else. We talked with Dave Tuttle, the Vice President of Product Strategy for ZipRecruiter, who focuses on the products and services that specifically serve some of ZipRecruiter's largest clients.
In layman's terms, that means that I focus on clients with large-scale hiring needs and the job seekers who aspire to work for large companies. So I focus on making sure that our platform, our job seeker experience, and what we can offer to large employers is best in class.
So Dave actually studied innovation and entrepreneurship and these human conditions that give rise to innovation. This is fascinating to me because sometimes innovation seems like something that occurs, not something that you set out to create. But ZipRecruiter sees things differently.
Innovation is something that by its nature is very collaborative, but there's also conditions within that collaboration that give rise to innovation, right? So you have to be very open, very honest, very communicative. You also have to be able to challenge what you know to be true, and then do that constantly and evaluate it with metrics. It sounds very intuitive while I'm saying it, but it's not something that's naturally intuitive to the human experience.
By fostering a culture of openness and placing a focus on collaborative communication, ZipRecruiter is able to constantly improve its technology, matching employers with the best quality candidates for their jobs.
And now you can try it for free. Just go to ZipRecruiter.com/AI. That's ZipRecruiter.com/AI. One more time, ZipRecruiter.com/AI. ZipRecruiter, the smartest way to hire. I hope you enjoyed this episode of American Innovations. If you did, please do give us a 5-star review and tell your friends to subscribe. We're available on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, NPR One, and every major listening app, as well as at Wondery.com. If you love the info you just heard, the author of this series, Sam Kean, has several wonderful books about DNA, neuroscience, and more. His book on DNA is called The Violinist's Thumb, and it's available wherever books or ebooks are sold. You can learn more about his books on his website, samkeen.com, or you can follow the links in the show notes. And a quick note about the historical recreations you've been hearing. In most cases, we can't know exactly what was said, but these scenes are based on real historical research. If you're listening on a smartphone, tap or swipe over the cover art of this podcast. You'll find the episode notes, including some details you may have missed. You'll also find some offers from our sponsors. Please support our show by supporting them. And thank you. American Innovations is hosted by me, Stephen Johnson. For more information on my books on innovation, like How We Got to Now and Wonderland, you can visit my website at stephenberlinjohnson.com. Sound design on this episode is by Bay Area Sound. This episode is written by Sam Keane. The producer is George Lavender. Executive produced by Marshall Louis for Wondery.